Okay, welcome back to our mini webinar series on designing games for professional military education. Today we're going back to school. We're going to be looking at a divisional level war game currently in use by the British Army's Intermediate Command and Staff Course Land. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Major Mark Martin, who is the current lead designer for Divisional Commander, which we'll be talking about in a second. I just want to state for the record that Mark's giving his comments today as an individual, and they are not reflective of the British Army, Ministry of Defence, or Defence Academy of the United Kingdom. I'll also give him a plug for his podcast, The History Syndicate, which I had a brief scan through today. Mark, I'm gonna go through that in detail on some of my commutes, but he's got a much better voice. He's got a much better voice than me for radio, and probably real face as well. So Mark, welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself, a bit of background, how you got into the role of lead designer for Divisional Commander?
Hi, Ed. Thanks very much for having us on. So I was posted into the Land and Command and Staff College to instruct on the Intermediate Command and Staff Course Land, as you said. And over time, it became obvious that I had an interest in wargaming, which was mostly hobbyist wargaming. So of the different types of wargaming that was available in defense, if you're going to be talking about seminar gaming, matrix gaming, Kriegsspiel, or hobbyist, it was a case of that I was very much a hobbyist background in terms of wargaming. So I had no experience in terms of wargaming design. Had no experience in terms of wargame facilitation, apart from playing as a hobby player with different hobby sets. And that ranged all the way from sort of anything Warlord to Two Fat Lardies, mostly historical wargaming. And historical wargaming was my particular passion, as you can tell, because the podcast is also about history. So I started to link those lessons together of, what can be learned about history via wargaming. Likewise, when you're just doing normal academic research into history. And then this became known, and we were talking about wargaming and history, and there had already been a task that was set to bring in an execution methodology after planning. So on the course members will learn formation level planning at the divisional level, which is a step up at their time in their career, because not many of them will have had that experience up until that point. And so it's about thinking about formation level planning problems. But there was no way to test or to generate those further conversations about what works, what doesn't work, what considerations should one have made. Additionally, it also allows one to talk about risk and communicate in terms of risk, and also to learn lessons in sort of relative combat power towards, what is lethality. And wargaming in this particular context, it's based in professional military education, does the basic thing that it's meant to do, which is generate the conversation. Now, wargaming is part of military planning. It always has been to an extent, but mostly in terms of course of action development wargaming, which was the fifth type of wargaming that I didn't mention earlier. And that runs throughout the sort of planning estimate. The difference with this wargame is that for many, it's a new methodology for an execution of planning. Now, I know you've had Vedette on previously with Battle Group Wargame System, and so that is being introduced on the more junior courses. So in terms of a wargaming culture, this is something that is becoming to be more inculcated in terms of the DNA of professional military education, to be able to use as a methodology to test plans. And that's because there's a paucity of people who actually understand this, execute it, and exercise it. But that community is now growing. It's growing at lower levels, which therefore makes it more applicable and more valuable. So that's sort of a rough background and intro into how I got into the wargaming and how I ended up becoming the lead designer, for want of a better phrase, on this particular game.
Awesome, that's great. I'm just going to move us on to some acknowledgements. So I've said in a previous webinar, it takes a village to raise a wargame. So there's another other names listed. We're not going to go through a line by line pack drill on this, but essentially just want to credit that this was a team effort, and also to highlight the test and iterate nature of good PME wargame systems. Someone potentially in October 23 might have got quite disheartened with the state of it, but now here we are in 25, and you've got, was it version 6 or something, but it's working, it gets better, and the fact that people want to improve it shows it's working, as opposed to throwing the baby out with the bathwater. So, Mark, if you want to call out anyone in particular in that, please do. Yeah.
Well, that's my mantra. It's playtest, 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 and I don't think anybody is particularly wedded to any parts of the systems that they help to develop here. And credits to, you can see the agile groups on there. They were brilliant in terms of providing the sort of mental agility that was required to say, we want to formulate this game away from just a simple division on division, and the main master question for the particular game is what is the difference that we are trying to teach in formation level planning between the divisional level of operations and a brigade level of operations. And that drive then started to say, well, the importance of the rear, the importance of the deep, as opposed to what most people focus upon in most games, which is the tactical close fight of particular individual weapon systems up to company battle group sort of level. So, and that's what we were driving after. But I think what a lot of people underestimate when they go out in terms of wargame design is the amount of time it takes, the amount of iterations that you have to run through, the playtest at not just an individual level, but at scale with, people who have not necessarily volunteered to play the game or to execute the game. So you will get different points of views from people who have not had any wargaming experience to those people who are full-on wargamers. And with those different experiences, we can then sort of bring those lessons into the game. I think one thing that has that drove the mechanics and iterations of the game was a strict adherence to this game is to teach the difference between divisional level planning problems and brigade level planning problems. What it is not necessarily to do is to be an exact replication of a division in a fight, because you can't necessarily achieve that. And that's why there are some areas where, if you've got subject matter expertise, they might push that particular area, and you're just like, well, that's not necessarily replicating the game, because that is not what it is trying to examine or teach in terms of the planning products that we've been examining on the course.
Yeah, that's great context. And for those who aren't familiar with British Army officer career development courses, this wargame sits in the third touch point. If you think of Sandhurst as being sort of touch point 0 commissioning, you then come back for a junior officer's tactical awareness course as a lieutenant to promote to captain, where you focus on battle group operations. So check out Battle Group Wargaming System webinar, that's that sort of thing. Then you come back as a mid-level to senior captain on what was called the Captain's Warfare course. It's probably called Junior Command and Staff LAN now, where you look at brigade level operations. And then this is the third certain touch point. If you promote to Lieutenant Colonel, you may have other subsequent training. But this is the last time as a major that you will definitively get training. And this is where we're touching on the division level and a load of other stuff in the syllabus, but in the operations space, we're looking at divisional level stuff. And then subsequent to this course, the majors will go and do some staff job and then look to take over a subunit. So in the infantry, that would be a company. So the British company commander has effectively planned divisional level operations, everything up to divisional level operations, and is commanding at a company level. So huge wealth of knowledge and context that helps situate their small piece, the subunit, the fighting subunit, in that. All right, without further ado, we're actually going to take a little look at the game system itself. So like a lot of the systems I've talked about, there's a tabletop. The game is on the tabletop, has a number of components such as maps, counters, charts, some cube pieces, the rules, and the 2d6 sitting nice and neatly in the dice holder there. And generally speaking, with games of this nature, there's often staff lookup tables and military references, which will be on the side or on the laptop. So the presence of the laptop there is not to be confused with some kind of computer-assisted adjudication, although some games do have that. So Mark, talk to me about any sort of design criteria that you might have had to push it into this level, certainly the size being one of them.
Okay, so the sort of design criteria for it was the ability to be able for 150 to 200 people to execute multiple games. So there may well be anywhere between 10 and 15 games being executed at once. The game that you see on the screen there is an open system, obviously, where you can see both sides of the board can be seen. There's a whole sort of God view, although you cannot necessarily conduct any sort of strikes or any actions, particularly until you've found something in an ISR phase, which we'll come to later when we look at the turn sequence. This particular game that you're looking at there looks pretty down and messy in terms of, it's a bit compressed, but you can see there are some significant design components that actually the biggest problem that we had during the game is that we wanted to replicate as best as possible the problems and operations that people would be conducting, but at the same time making the game accessible. So one of the biggest things that one had to consider was the training pathway for somebody who has no experience whatsoever to be able to pick up this game and play it, which the learning curve is steep, even though it doesn't replicate absolutely everything. But it's as you say, it's entirely analog. You can see that there are a number of different components which we can go through in a bit. But the point is it has to be accessible, and that's where the battle board idea came in later on, which we'll discuss in depth when we actually explain the game mechanics. So that was the first sort of design dilemma. How do we make it accessible? Previous iterations of games or execute methodologies required high cons or, sort of higher controllers or higher facilitators, low cons, lower controllers, lower facilitators to feed a narrative into a sort of a central execute training audience. And that meant that in terms of the training audience, only a few people are getting training value. Whereas those who are in the high con and the low con are not necessarily getting the same training value as those who are being exercised and testing their plans. So the next the sort of design dilemma was about not only accessibility, but the inclusion and the engagement of the whole training audience. And whether that's they are getting the experience in terms of a functioning execute cell or the facilitator cell. So it should be said that while you can see it in an open game here, and on this particular element of the course, we look at urban operations, and the urban operations focus is around sort of urban terrain zones and the effective urban terrain zones. The main game, when it is executed at divisional levels, is a double-blind Kriegsspiel, which is a classic Kriegsspiel in that regard, and we can talk about that later. So that was the second design dilemma in terms of engagement of everybody. Is everybody getting, firstly, the training objectives that we want them to get, and also a positive experience of the execute game. The next design dilemma, it does talk to that last point in terms of it's about developing a culture of people who feel like that they can engage with a game and get value from it. A lot of the time people think, well, I don't know about that, and therefore they will back off that in terms of engagement. I don't know it. I don't understand it necessarily because I've not been trained on it, and therefore they may withdraw. And that's where you might withdraw, and you might say, well, you mentioned that the laptop there, they go, well, why can't we just have a game where all I have to do is plug in my parameters and it gives me a result, or it does a simulation, or it does a model, which is not what we're after. We're after deep understanding of where people can conduct these games in an analog fashion for themselves, because there's a paucity of people who can do it. And yes, there are courses coming in to allow for wargame fundamentals, facilitation, and design. But culture takes time. And so part of the whole accessibility, engagement, those two dilemmas, the next one becomes about culture. And therefore, when we're setting up the games, we have to get left of the bang somewhat. And so early on in the course, we introduced a matrix game that people can pick up and play within 15 minutes. And so they sort of, oh, I can do wargaming. This is not something that is the purview of other people or particular experts. I can do this in a good enough fashion for it to be valuable towards my analysis and my planning. And so there's that cultural sort of aspect as well. So, and that therefore also buys out a bit of that learning curve and training burden in terms of getting people up to speed to play this particular game as well. Have I answered all your questions there, Ed? Did I miss anything out?
Yeah, no, that's great stuff, mate. I just want to emphasize that the majors coming through now in 2025 would have probably gone through Sandhurst in 2015, 16 time frame. So the chance to go back and give them a wargaming experience at the start of this journey has been lost. But the movement is afoot to put wargaming at the right level. So Platoon and company into Sandhurst, the battle group wargaming system, as you've already mentioned, going into the other courses. So in a couple of years, you won't have majors arriving who have been uninitiated to the concepts of wargaming, and actually that means that you can get more juice from the lemon than sort of explaining, the lemon to the majors, which is often the problem. Even with senior officers with wargaming, all the time is spent explaining how the game works rather than getting them to actually use the game to generate some kind of positive outcome.
Exactly. There's no point in if you start fighting the game. Actually, one thing I found with wargaming is that it can tell you a lot about people's behaviors and approach as well, which then comes into team cohesion, how people can work into teams, how well people deal with pressure as well. So part of the idea behind the Kriegsspiel, which comes onto dilemma sort of 4, is, it's about adversarial thinking. So if wargaming's at their heart are to be adversarial, you can go back to Peter Parler or whoever's going to be speaking about that in terms of the foundations of wargaming. If it must be adversarial and cannot be replicated as an experience, you need to be able to provide a situation of where it can put people under pressure, where they are going to make decisions and they're going to have to live with the consequences of those decisions. Record it, and then you can look back at it and say, well, why did you make that decision? It could have been quite simply they go, so we see quite a lot that people go, well, blue took absolutely ages, red were all over it. And they, as soon as we asked for something from red, it was there, it was done. Blue took ages. And then I was saying, well, what might that indicate for you? And then when they sit back and they reflect on it, they go, well, actually, that perhaps red were in the OODA loop of blue and they were reacting faster, and therefore they own the initiative. Okay, so therefore we have a lesson about initiative in this particular case at divisional level. So it's just about trying to bring out that, that extra, as you say, juice from the squeeze in terms of professional military education. One of the things I major on when we talk about course of action development wargaming, and in lectures when we go through all the principles of wargaming, like being adversarial and not replicable and all those sorts of things. One of the things that I try to get across to people is, what is your master question? And this is sort of dilemma 5, I think I'm on. What is the master question in terms of what is the game designed to do? And therefore, if you're doing a war game, what are you actually trying to explore? Because one of the things I've seen with wargaming is that wargaming's inevitably become a rehearsal of the plan, like a rehearsal of concept drill. And I feel that that does have value, but if you're doing that, you're actually losing the detail of the game. You should, for me, it should be a case of select the time or a risk or something that is most important to your plan and do that, because you're not going to have time to pretty much war game every plan. And if all you're doing is a rock drill, you're just rehearsing your steps. You're not actually testing the assumptions that you have made in your planning. I feel that's where most people go wrong in terms of military gaming, and then it just becomes a pedestrian sort of walk through the plan, and we talk through a couple of things, we capture a couple of things, and then it's a case of, well, what do we need to do? We need to get after things specifically at the decisive point and say, hey, what is the game telling us? Yes, this is not going to work, therefore perhaps we need more assets, perhaps we need to do it at this time of day or this time of night, perhaps we need to do, and answer those questions from the conversation that it generates. And this is something that we've taken forward into this game, to be able to generate people to talk about divisional level problems in a sort of an after action review format.
Yeah, and as ever, I keep making the point that there's a virtuous feedback loop between lessons learned in execution, which improve mental models in planning, of which Koa wargaming then starts to become more representative of the sort of situations you were surprised about in execution wargaming. So Koa wargaming becomes more valuable. It's the first thing that gets cut in the planning timeline, and the way it's often briefed is a sort of, you spend an hour describing the wargame and 10 minutes playing it, and as you say, it's the move out of the assembly area to the crossing point, and then we're done. So I do think there's that virtuous feedback loop that will take time to work and is difficult to see when you only do anything once, as with anything in life. So hopefully we'll see more of that. I'm going to move us on just for the sake of time.
Sure.
So this is me. I'm just going to explain some concepts for the lay people who might not understand what we're going to talk about, some of the concepts. So the first one is, what is a division? This is not a British division that exists. This is a fictional one created by Nick Drummond, who's big on Twitter advertising future structures for the British Army. So the first thing to say is that it's a large body of troops, sort of north of 20,000, depending on how it's structured and organized. Generally consists of a number of maneuver brigades. Those are the three vertical columns you can see on the left, which generally consist of some kind of cavalry, armored. This one has heavy cavalry, main battle tanks, and then mechanized or armored infantry. And this, it's got some logistics and medical. It might have a lighter or more medium style formation in APCs or in motorized transport, so on and so forth. Again, 3 brigades is pretty standard. Sometimes you see 4, sometimes you see 2, depending on the type of division that's been structured. The blue brigade shown here is a fires brigade. That's where all the fire assets have been grouped. That does not mean they get employed as a brigade fire mission of fires, and we'll explore sort of the use of these kind of assets of rockets, guns, and UAS, and so on and so forth. And then engineers, signalers, and more sustainment, which will come into the sort of command and rear operations. If you are a sort of hobby wargamer, you might be very familiar with the maneuver brigades being sort of your counter pieces, with a heavy cavalry counter, an infantry counter, and moving those around. And a lot of the other stuff might be abstracted to the point of a supply check, such as tracing a line of supply back to your side of the map, and so on and so forth. Or off-map support effects, and so on and so forth. But this is all going to get modeled in detail, and just bringing that to people's attention. The next one is the concept of deep, close, and rear. Mark's already said it a few times. You might be thinking, what are these concepts? So I'm going to explain it in very outline terms. So it's a geographic framework. The phraseology for the division is that it fights the deep, protects the rear, resources the close. So the deep is our stuff forward of where our own troops are, and it's largely looking into areas where we wouldn't expect to find enemy frontline troops dug in trenches. We would expect to be finding command, headquarters, logistic nodes, logistic trains, air defense assets, longer range fires, we're talking many tens of kilometers into the deep. The actual ranges keep changing based on the technology that we have, and that's often a challenge for Doctrine to keep up. But the deep is effectively the enemy's rear, so all the stuff that's vulnerable. And if you think of a systems theory, if you destroy or damage something in the enemy's rear in your deep, then it's going to create problems for their front line, their close. Okay, and vice versa is also true. The close area in the middle is where a lot of the fighting troops are in the close combat, the direct fire engagements. And that is what a lot of hobby wargamers or other game systems are focused on. So, for example, the battle group wargame system would entirely be fixed, would be entirely happening in the close fight, and even a small subset of that would be, a platoon level action. And then the rear, which again gets very short shrift in a lot of commercial and hobby games, because frankly most people aren't interested in that sort of stuff, although it is absolutely essential. And most of the great sort of captains of the ancient world were good at the close because they had good rear links to their supply nodes and so forth. So everything behind the close that can go all the way back to your national base is described as the rear. And again, there's different ways to group it, such as the tactical rear and the sort of operational and strategic rear and all that. But essentially, that's where the friendly logistic nodes, the supply dumps, command, and high value targets are going to exist. Now, the challenge with a war game is trying to replicate all of this. This could be a complete hex and counter map, the entire thing, and you move everything around with a lot of counters. And certainly there are games out there with those examples. But it's quite a lot to take in. It can be quite challenging. So this game system, which we'll explain, is trying to focus on them in 3 discrete parts: the deep, the rear, and then the close in that order, to cover off all the areas that the division focuses on. And again, Mark's already said it. People come to this wanting to get into the close and the detail of the maneuver fight, and actually, it's setting the unfair close fight by having a good deep phase and also maintaining the rear. Mark, anything on that before I move us on to the next slide?
No, sorry, mate. It's yeah, that's really that's really well put. I mean, if we go on to the next slide, I can show how it's been put into other aspects that have to be overlaid onto it, and then we'll talk about the turn sequence. So essentially, the game relies on combat power in the sense of while it does use force ratios for some of its resolution mechanic, combat power is a relative term in terms of, one armored subunit is going to be worth X versus a protecting mobility unit that's going to be worth Y. Yet you can make Y better if you give it some anti-tank assets, and therefore its relative combat power will change towards the tanks, for example. And this is all dictated just by using a spreadsheet where you can calculate relative combat powers, and then you track that through the game. The regeneration points are basically when attrition happens due to enemy action, you can regenerate elements of your maneuver units to, put them back into the fight. And that can be done in 3 separate locations in the game. And we can come on to that in a second. And then you have supply tokens. And supply tokens basically are an aggregated form of all the different classes and elements of supply. So supply is everything from ammunition to water to spare tires, engine blocks, whatever. They are just an idea in terms of professional military education for people to be able to talk about the rear and demonstrate how the rear is what actually enables all the actions in the deep and enables the close fight to be prosecuted, as Ed said, in the most unfair of terms as you possibly can, because you want all the advantages possible. And in that case, it should become anticlimactic because it should be a done deal if you've done all of the other stuff right. But if you don't get the rear right, nothing else happens. And that's one of the main lessons that this game system is trying to bring to life and for people to visualize and experience when they're putting their plans into action. So if you want to flip a slide, Ed, and it will go into the turn sequence. So on the turn sequence, you can see it's split into 5. So the deep rear and close mechanic, you can see are points 3, 4, and 5. But before that, we have a turn introduction, and that is done by the facilitator. It ranges from, this is the weather, this is the time of day. Is it day? Is it night? The game itself works on a day-night mechanic that works between 0600 to 1800 to represent daylight, 1800 to 0600 to represent nighttime. and then any significant actions that have happened in terms of the wider narrative that you can bring into the game. So the game operates on I would say it's a semi-rigid adjudication system in terms of what the facilitators bring in. There is a rule book of which, you know, is the rigid element, but judgment and narrative can be brought into it depending upon what lessons and what's gone on and what conversations have happened to be able to provide the wrap for the game and get the lessons out of it that you want to. So in that case, it's semi-rigid. So the intro goes to, if you're playing the Kriegsspiel version, as particularly, it will go to both red and blue concurrently. Then the game system itself goes into an I go, you go system, depending upon who has the initiative. So whoever has the initiative will go first, and then they will go into their command phase. And in their command phase, they will give over what their intent for the broad intent for what the term is going to be from their sort of concept of operations. They will also allocate forces to particular bigger muscle moves, for want of a better phrase, rather than the detailed actions of individual subunits in the close. They will then have a discussion about opportunities that they might try to exploit, which has come out of their planning, or indeed some of the risks. And at this point, the adjudicator or the facilitator would turn around and say whether those opportunities or risks have been realized and play them into the narrative of the game. Then they would give any intent to deceive, whether that's playing a fog of war mechanic, which is basically a dispersal mechanism which prevents people from being targeted, but also at the same time prevents them being able to conduct any other actions. And, you know, whether they're going to be trying to use some sort of information operation, whether, you know, sort of to create a deception in terms of the minds of the enemy. Because one thing that the game is trying to get after is the cognitive battle between live players, as opposed to, you know, in real time, because they're making decisions just as much as it is in terms of what's going on the board. Then they get to offer anything that they would like in terms of a higher request or a higher reporting, whether that's further assets that are not available to the division, or, you know, whether they expect some sort of report and return back from higher on something that they've said in the previous turn or 12-hour cycle. And then all of the fighting units, so everyone who is in the close, loses a supply token, which represents the sort of just existence of just being in the field, whether that's consuming rations, ammunition, all of those sorts of things. So a supply consumption gets taken off all of the individual fighting units. And that's important because supply equals an action. And therefore, by default, the fighting units are going to lose one supply just for existing each turn, which then starts to get people to start thinking, well, I have to keep them supplies, because if they get to the point of where they have no supply and they get to this point and they're at this point in the turn sequence, they start getting attrition in the narrative of it could be disease, non-battle injury, because you're not keeping people sufficiently supplied in the field, etc. Then it will go over, that would be whoever's got the initiative, then it will go over to the opposition and they will do their command phase. Then both move into the deep, and this again remains an I go, you go system with the initiative going, with whoever's got the initiative going first. And the deep is where in the divisional fight, most of the time is spent during the turn sequence. So you'll be talking, we do an inject for theatre ISR, which could be related to their planning and requests that they've made in the command phases or in previous planning, of which would then get focused upon particular areas of the enemy or ground that they are looking for information on. They will then get to move all their organic ISR, which, you know, is in terms of remotely piloted air systems or drones, as most people would know them, whether they're going to be moving any aviation, whether they're going to be looking to do some information surveillance or reconnaissance using aircraft that they've been allocated. Then they would go on to do their ground ISR, which is their ground maneuver reconnaissance. And there are mechanics in that of when they move towards their areas of interest that they can come under contact, they can bypass enemy, but in the manner in which that happens, the facilitation cell is determining the information that they're getting back, which is going back into the cells. And then any other ISR that can come into play. The idea of the organic ISR phase is that It's about getting people physically in the right places over the areas of interest as per their planning to get information. And that information comes from the resolve ISR step, where an asset will have a value of which they will roll over an area of interest to give a fidelity score, and this will be shown on a page later. And that fidelity score ranges from nothing seen all the way up to it can contain all the information about the enemy in terms of it goes up from like enemy presence to enemy force strength to particular assets to their full combat power to the ID of the unit. The idea being that the more you can layer your ISR, you get benefit for having more assets on board. And at the same time, you know, the more persistent you are, the more turns you do it, the higher the fidelity is going to increase on that particular area of interest. Why is this? It's about teaching layering and those sorts of things, as opposed to just smattering out assets all over the place to try and cover everyone. You know, as Frederick the Great said, he who defends everything defends nothing. It's the same in the case of ISR. You try and see everything, you're not going to see anything. Then once fidelities have come in and you may well have seen some enemy, or if there are no enemy present and there is a good fidelity on the resolve ISR, you can stay in Overwatch to maybe conduct RT ambush or something like that. And then you are elected to do strikes. Now, once you start fighting strikes, that starts taking up supply, which I can explain in a moment. But it allows you to start attriting the enemy in the deep, wherever you've determined that deep to be. Or shaping, you know, elements of the fighting echelons in the close for your brigades. But if you, in doing so, and in terms of air defense comes into this as well, you then have, you can be subject to counter strikes, which will be the enemy artillery or assets finding your own assets that have been engaging and striking them back. And that's how a deep phase works. And that takes the significant chunk of the turn. And then it passes over to the other deep phase for the opposition. Now, in that, there is a narrative that goes backwards and forwards between both teams, because as one is being struck, they're obviously reporting to the other team that they're under fires or whatever, or that they can see perhaps a remotely piloted air system. Do you engage with air defense? There are discussions and activity going on both sides at the same time. And this goes back to that engagement principle, that people should not be sitting there doing nothing. There is always something to be doing, iterating and planning and keeping your operating picture up to scratch. The amount of people who go, well, we reported there was nothing seen in that area of interest. Well, yeah, exactly. There was nothing seen, but there still might have been something there. Or there was something seen, and then when they get to at the end of the game, when they see there is nothing there anymore, you know, it's moved on, but they haven't kept their cop or kip up to date, or they haven't necessarily moved with the fight, and they've, you know, not managed their assets very well to make sure that they've got all the information necessary to keep prosecuting the battle. So the I go, you go, the deep happens, and then the rear, and then it moves into the rear, and the rear happens concurrently. And we'll explain that mechanic as we go further on, and then it goes into the anticlimactic close, and depends upon force ratios, the shaping, any additional sort of considerations that could be taken into account, such as combined arms groupings, attacking at night, any you know, any effects on deception, etc. There is a dice resolution mechanic, as you can see there on 2d6. And one of the things I should have said in the deep as well, which is not necessarily listed on Counter-Strike, after the Counter-Strike phase, to bring in multi-domain sort of battle, there has been, you know, electronic warfare elements have been added, as well as information operations, etc., which can be shaping or decisive, depending upon what you're trying to do to the enemy. Does that explain the turn sequence, Ed?
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's a great job. And for those who are watching thinking, well, it sounds like there's a lot going on, one of the things I really like about this game design is that there is a one single placemat with all of the tracking on. And to use an example of, I've seen previous examples where some poor person has got the Excel of Doom open and is trying to track water, rations, 5.56, 7.62 ammo, everything up to HIMARS missiles, with a war game that doesn't give him any fidelity of what any of that's going on, and it's just kind of playing with fake numbers. So the supply cubes, as an example, are a great abstraction, which allows you to focus on the core point of, does everyone have enough supply, rather than what's the exact number of water bottle replens we're doing, and stuff like that, which just gets into absurdity, and everyone sort of loses interest, and no one wants that command appointment. So with that, Mark, if you can explain how the battle board works.
Yeah, so I mean, if you remember one of the very first slides where it looked at all the iterations of Divisional Commander, it got to the point last year where we're iterating, and with those complexities, it was like, well, I need to be able to keep it accessible, which was that second design point. And the best way to have it accessible is just have one singular board in front of you with some bulky blocks and tokens on it that you can just aggregate things up to get the proper lessons, as you were talking about there, in terms of it's good enough just to know it's about supply. In this particular game, it is not a logistics war game. It is designed to, as I said, to teach the fundamentals of a divisional fight compared to a brigade fight. And so it's about representing that on one singular board. And this, if A3 is big enough, but if you can get it up higher than that, actually, it's pretty good, because you move your tokens around, and so you have enabling tokens that are placed into the boxes, and you can set the game up however you want to constrain it to reflect that people might have done bumper supplies or whatever, but essentially you can see that the command phase on the top left is the first thing that happens. And if the command gets allocated any air sorties, you put an enabling token in the air sorties box, and it's there to play in your deep phase. You then go into your deep phase, and you can see the bullet points there, which I've already explained. And you can see that is split into aviation. So that's combat aviation. So think attack helicopter, strike, which is artillery, counter strike, as in sort of counter artillery fires, your air defense, and then close support. Close support is its own thing, in the close support actually comes into play in the close phase, but that's a nuance about artillery supporting the close. And then you've got sort of information operations, EWs, that are represented by info and comms, of which you can do attack or defense, and shaping or decisive in terms of info 1 and info 2. And you get two goes at that in your deep phase. So you conduct all of your actions in the deep phase as previously discussed. Then in your rear phase, you will have your in your deep phase, every time you do a strike action, you lose an enabling token. So you can already see that the mechanic is designed about where do you allocate your enabling tokens, your supply tokens. So where are all these supply tokens going? So you're making decisions about how you're going to break them up. If you're worried about enemy air, and you're trying to do air defense, you might stack that. But in doing so, you might not have enough as much supply in strike. So your targeting ability becomes a lot less. So you're making decisions about where you're putting your supply. And actually, in terms of sort of gunnery, etc., you are making decisions about what effects that you want and why, and then you have to prioritize the assets that you're willing to use those supply tokens on. So you can't just basically go and play whack-a-mole. Well, you can, but you'll run out very quickly, and then the enemy will come back to you, and you've got nothing to do anything about it. So in the rear phase, in the brigade supplies, these basically represent the brigade supply groups. You can see there is a supply area and there is a repair area. In the supply area, usually there will be about 3 supply tokens in there, which represent, effectively store squadrons and close support squadrons that run the supply into the along the supply loops into the close area, and vice versa from the main supply. So that's where the supply sits there. And in the rear phase, what happens is supply moves from the brigade supply areas into, as you can see on the close phase boxes, the brigade supply areas, which then enables them to do actions. From then, you can then move main supply, which represents everything from your divisional supply back all the way to your, your national homeland, I suppose. And those stores mounts, you can move forward in either into your deep area, or you can move them into your rear area. So you can see that to move from main supply into the deep or the rear is effectively a 12-hour loop cycle, as it is to move from the rear phase to the close. But it takes 24 hours effectively, therefore, to get from main supply all the way through to the close. So you have to plan ahead and prioritize ahead. So you cannot simply just react and say, we'll shoot that now, or do this now, or mission command will solve that, or whatever. You have to plan. So good planning buys people space for mission command. And that's one of the things that this is trying to teach. In terms of damage, so as attrition happens, you start getting attrition either from the deep or from the close. You can see there are damage boxes in the close phase against the brigades. Those damage, so every time you get attrition, you'll put a red token in there as a sort of a regeneration point. And that therefore is temporarily, it represents a particular combat power depending upon what that's in that brigade. And that will remove that combat power from the overall brigade combat power temporarily. You can then, in your rear phase, attempt to repair forward, as you can see in the close, which in this case is a 16.6% chance of repair, which represents the fact that people can repair things forward, but they don't have the workshops. They don't necessarily have all of the kit and equipment. They can do some things, but not everything. So you can take that risk of repairing forward. If you do manage to repair that attrition token or that regeneration token forward, it gets immediately returned back into the fight and into the combat power of that brigade. It's no longer temporarily removed. Or you can make the decision in that turn to spend the 12 hours moving it back into the brigade echelon repairs, where in the subsequent 12-hour period, you can then you can elect to have the 50-50 chance of whether it's going to return. If the roll is successful, it goes straight back into the combat power of the brigade as per. If not, just like in the close, it is completely removed from the combat power permanently. Again, you can then spend another 12 hours, should you wish, to move from brigade esh repair into units in rear echelon. So it goes back to third, fourth line homeland or industry, where there is a significant chance that that asset can be repaired and then move forward. So you're taking a decision in your sort of equipment support space of, do a repair forward and I can get it back quicker, but there's a higher risk that it might be permanently lost, or do I take the time to send it backwards to guarantee its return? But there's a trade-off between time and repair on that. And then you move into the close phase. So everything is represented on the battle board. And I don't know, is there a picture of it on the next slide with the tokens on? It's in 2 slides time, actually.
Yeah, 2 slides time, yeah.
It's in 2 slides time. But let me just explain how this is going. So on the next slide, you can see the Kriegsspiel Setup, which is essentially, in this case, use the model of a made-up HQ Friedel against a made-up HQ 9 Bothnian division, which is part of the NATO Skullcan scenarios. And you can see that they are completely split, double-blind Kriegsspiel, as many will recognize, but everybody has a dedicated role. Everybody is engaged. There is nobody who is not engaged in either the deep, rear, or close mechanic of this particular action, as well as the decisions that they have to make. And currently, we run it over, as you bullet pointed on the board. We run it over a sort of 72 hours of operations in terms of the cycle. So we look to get 6 turns in, essentially, if we can. And in the XCon, and the cognitive burden in the XCon shouldn't be underestimated, actually, because we get a course member who is going to lead it and deputize as well. So they have to be trained to be able to not only understand the game, but then be able to communicate it in and out, and also do all the practicalities of moving tokens, introducing tokens, turning communication systems on and off at the right time to be able to move backwards and forwards to maintain that fog of war, to increase the friction and the pressure upon those making decisions during the game. And that's essentially how the Kriegsspiel operates. I assume that's very familiar to everyone, Ed, and you're happy with
Yeah,
that
the only thing I'd
explanation?
say is a lot of war games have an open system by design. Obviously, this is a multimodal war game. The thing for lay people and hobby war gamers, just to emphasize, is that as you say, like everyone's sharing a sort of portion of the load. So there isn't one person who's trying to fight the division. Everyone is trying to fight the division by focusing on air, other than the commander maybe. But the person who's in charge of fires is really going to be focused on that deep box, deep phase. The person in CSS is looking all about the supply cubes. The J2 person is interested in one thing about what the enemy's doing, two, linking that to the ISR, and three, once the fidelity and fines occurred, going back to their assumptions and theories. And so therefore it's not overwhelming one poor person who's trying to do the entire battle board. The other point is, though, that they have done 3 days of, maybe not 3 days of planning, but they planned 3 days. Whereas a lot of wargaming experiences are, you open the box, you set it up, you have a quick scan of the rules, then you go. You haven't really got a plan. You're making it up as you go along, and that's fine for a lot of gaming and a lot of sub-tactical actions. You're constantly refreshing that OODA loop. The point here is that people don't need to understand and cognitate for hours for the turns, because they've already got the plan. And you mentioned to me earlier that they actually plan both sides of the aisle. So a syndicate plans both, and they don't know which one they're going to get. So there's not often there is a case of sometimes watering down red. The red team is selected last minute, and there isn't really a red plan, and they're kind of executing a reverse blue plan, and it's all a bit awkward. But it seems like you've gone over that. So if you want to just give a minute on that, and now I'll move us on to the next.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, they plan 4 or 5 days worth of planning for blue, 2-3 days worth of planning for red. A syndicate will, well, we do double syndicates in terms of the planning, so you can have anywhere up to 30 individuals doing that plan and different aspects of that planning, whatever role they are in. And what will happen then is they plan blue, they will then plan red, and then they will execute against a completely different syndicate. So nobody who has had any involvement in their particular planning, same scenario, but different, but they would have come to different conclusions. And they execute, they don't know which plan they're going to execute, and they don't know who they are going to be executing against either. So that particular card is played close to the chest until the last minute, and they said, well, here you go, you're going to be blue, you're going to be red, you're playing that team over there, and you're playing that team over there who you've never met before. So it keeps people completely unread into the next plan. They might have their ideas, they might have their own sort of intelligence assessment on it, but that's up to them, and that's all part of the game. So in this particular setup, it's worth noting that this is not 1-on-1, as you said. This is not 4-on-4, 5-on-5. This is anywhere between 5-on-5 to 10-on-10, but 30 people involved in the whole game, because the XCon is also staffed by members from different syndicates as well. So everybody's getting the full flavor of the plan, the war game experience, as well as all the conversations and the particular frictions that a Kriegsspiel brings in. And this is ambitious to do, and we've achieved it.
Yeah, and that should not be underestimated. I've seen contracted war games the army's paid probably millions for, where there's a bit of a range ring. The contractors are engaged. The people immediately next to the contractors are engaged. And as the range ring goes out, the interest engagement drops off, and people are just checking emails on their laptops. And it's again, the headline is like, we ran a war game for 50 people, and my comment would be 5 people were in that war game and 45 people were somewhere else in their head, but were just physically in the same room. So I think it's great to do, and designing that sort of competitive fog of war, the human fog of war, let alone the mechanical fog of war, I think it's great.
Well, and you know, when we experience that, and so we've experimented with different sizes of cells to increase engagement. And I think 5 or 6 in each cell is probably about right now, in terms of, you know, to get really high quality engagement, which then means you are on a course of 150 to 200 people, you know, you're running 20 games at once, sort of thing, which is sort of where we're at, which is great because it means everybody's getting the training experience.
As promised, here's some pictures of the components. So you've got the battle board on the right and some mapping on the left. Again, one thing to sort of highlight is that there's no hexes and counters and sort of, you know, change topography to make it nice and neat. It is real maps of whatever scale they particularly choose to use. These are often quite zoomed out because we're talking about brigades and maneuvering across the ground, and all the battlefield markings that the planning has done are then transposed onto that map as well. So it's not a hex and counter or measuring distance. There's a lot of using the plan to drive the mechanics of the game forward, Mark.
Yeah, and these are from some of the play testing that we have done. These are rough and ready photos. So you can see on the sort of left-hand image, you can see that there are tokens, there are combat powers that are allocated within those tokens. But you can also see, if you take the left-hand red token, you can see a sort of mechanized infantry brigade with a combat power to its right-hand side. But then you look sort of top left of that, you can see that there is actually something in Overwatch on a particular route. So when that brigade is being, if it moves through there, it can be targeted. If it's being supplied, the supply can be targeted, which gets after that deep fight that Ed was talking about earlier on. So this is from some of the play testing. And on the right-hand side, you can see, you know, it's just been rough and ready marked up, but you can see the supply tokens that are all allocated in different areas. You can see that there are different amounts in different areas, so prioritization has occurred. And these are the beige cubes that are in there. In this particular case, you can see it's on turn 5, so it's getting towards the end of the game, and in daytime. In the deep phase, they've got quite a lot stacked in aviation, which is the first box there, but then they've got nothing in strike, which suggests that they've either fired all of their assets, or, you know, they're prioritizing actually going into the sort of decisive action. So the right-hand side box on that deep on that deep battle board has got 3 cubes in it, and that is allocated to close support. So I mentioned that close support has a special rule. So what close support supply tokens do is they increase combat power for the first round of, well, whenever you allocate them. Actually, it could be, most people put it into the first round, but you can have it in the second or third or fourth round as long as you keep spending them. And they increase combat power by 5 combat power, which makes a significant difference in terms of having that artillery or that fire support in the close as well. You can also see on that battle board, actually, there is an attrition token in brigade. I think it's Brigade 3, Brigade Charlie's brigade support area in the rear. So you can see that that would have been elected to be moved backwards from, in this case, what's been labelled as 803 Brigade. So that would have been a deliberate choice to move that one backwards to sort of guarantee its return. But having a look at this particular battle board, there's not a lot of attrition on it. There usually is a lot of attrition on it. So whoever's playing the opposite side on this one needs to do probably a little bit more work if we're in turn 5 and there's not that much attrition showing. But it's all about, once the mechanic is learning, you can see that the actual mechanic that drives the entire game is the rear mechanic, and the movement of these supply tokens, which drives people to think about, actually, most people like to focus on the close, but you're not going to do anything in the close unless you're getting everything right in the rear, and you're not going to be able to shape the close for the unfair fight if you're not doing the deep properly. And that's the whole point of learning a divisional fight.
So you mentioned on the right-hand box, right-hand image, there's a red degradation cube. I noticed on the left there's also some on the counters. Is this a double accounting? Is it you put one in the battle board and one on the unit that suffered the attrition, or is it tracked separately to remove the combat power, as in like rub out 48 and put 45?
So it's of the preference of the individual playing the game. If they want to mark it on the map, they can mark it on the map when it moves, or it can be on the battle board. There's no distinction really. It's not a case of double accounting or replication. The only difference in terms of the attrition mechanic is that if Recce is being hit, because Recce doesn't sit in any of these broader aggregated up areas. So if Recce units are being hit, they just get direct attrition on the map. In this case, it's got to be an upgun Recce, because Recce usually only has about 2 combat power. So I can't see what it is on that one. So it might have been upgunned in its task organization. But it's not a case of double accounting. It's a unique circumstance. But if that was going to be a brigade, it's down to the individual who wants to play it, whether they want to mark it on the map or they want to mark it on the battle board. It's up to them.
Fantastic. And one of the advanced rule sets that you have, and you mentioned this scenario in an earlier picture, is urban.
Yes.
So why did you choose? I mean, it's great that you've got it. Why did you choose to do it? And what's the sort of changes you had to make to the rule set to accommodate this sort of unique environment?
So the sort of unique environment of So the unique environment of urban operations is that we drew it down into different urban terrain zones, and the green markings on that particular map you can see are there, and they are set areas that have been given to deliberately teach different things about different urban areas. So you might have an industrial complex, just light industrial, residential complex, light residential, urban administrative center, and open areas, and they all have different effects upon different particular actions. So whether it's information operations tend to go up because of connectivity within the urban, but the close battle absolutely goes down because of the amount of rubberization, defensive assets, preparation that has gone on. So things become much more difficult and more attritional in different areas. But you can see air defense goes up in most of them as well. We base that on a judgment that people can get higher up. They can, they're harder to spot and to suppress. So therefore, you can engage easier with air defense. But your ISR will go down because there's more places to hide in the sort of physical urban clutter, if you like. And so this particular mechanic was played as an open game because what we don't necessarily want that we've done the frictions, we've done the behaviors and sort of the Kriegsspiel element, and in this case everybody can get round and see how it's all playing out ahead of them. Even though they can see enemy counters, those enemy counters could be flipped over to indicate that that you can't actually be targeted yet. You've still got to go and do the ISR fidelity on it. The interesting piece about the urban as well is that we didn't necessarily, because we're not playing it as a Kriegsspiel, you're not playing as red and completely adversarial red and blue. In this case, it's more there is a red cell of just 2 or 3 people who play a solitaire mechanic, which it can be driven by cards. There is a card version, which has a particular order of cards, which makes the enemy play out the most likely course of action or the most dangerous course of action, depending upon which you've planned against and you want to test the war game against. Or there is a randomized element in the rule set of where you get several actions in the deep, the command, several actions in the deep, several actions in the rear, several actions in the close, and you get dictated what you can do. The decisions that the players get to make is where that happens for red. There you go. And you can see that in this sort of random play and the probability statistics, it's still made to make sure that it has a limitation in that it doesn't allow red to play to win, if that's what you want to set red as. But what it does do is it makes sure that red is set to play to test the blue plan, which in the sort of educational environment and the sort of training objectives that we're trying to achieve is what the game was designed to do in this case. So you can see that, you know, they can decide where things are going to happen, but not necessarily what or when, which is interesting.
No, it's good. It's a good way to get around the sort of requirement to staff red completely. Another example could be you draw 3 cards at random, but then you pick the card which is the most damaging to you as the blue player from at that point in time, and that just sort of has an element of random, but an element of sort of positive selection. Because, but yeah, I think it's great, and
yeah, it's just
good.
a different. It's just an adjunct that's a different way of doing it, because what you don't necessarily want is if you have, let's say, an alpha player who has been allocated to be red, and they start throwing in extra problems, and you haven't told them to play to win where anything goes. With the best will in the world, people still become quite adversarial, and then they start playing elements that are not necessarily being planned against, and therefore you're testing the plan against a different set of assumptions that you have made in your planning, which can sometimes derail the experience of, if you're doing course of action development, it can derail the experience of, you know, what you're or the value of what you're actually trying to plan. Or in this case, if it is just if it is an execute game, it can devalue the experience of the execute, of which people then, when we go back to our sort of 4th or 5th design problem, which was all about the culture, then people become distrustful of it, which we don't want.
No, all good, all good. So talk to me about how you phased the teaching of the game to the students, and how they sort of received it.
So over time, I mean, over the last sort of 2.5 years of doing this, it's iterated as the game has itself. And it used to be I had to run several sessions of where people would have to give up their own time to come and learn the game and play the game. And it's very much a one-on-one teach. Whereas now we're in the position of using the battle boards. You can play the game without a map, which I think is one of its great strengths. You can still teach the lessons even if you haven't got a map in front of you. Now you can see on the left-hand side of the screen, you can see a setup that I've used to train. I mean, how many people? Probably 10, 12 people in this case, of where I've faced the red and blue off, and I've given them opposing sort of ops traces that you can see there in terms of, you know, areas of interest, of where they just play a singular brigade where I can introduce the mechanics of it. And the manner in which those ops traces are designed is that it will promote all of the aspects of the game design during the training session. And that training session will take about an hour. And about 12 people is probably about the max that you can teach at once. And in that hour, effectively, you can teach, it's now got to the point of where you can teach the game to people so they can facilitate it. And that's about right. Whereas previously it used to take probably about half a day, and then before that, 3 or 4 sessions. And that's where the advantage of the introduction of the battle board has really multiplied the accessibility for the game. But it's like any game, when you first do it, you either need somebody there to help you explain the rules, or the first turn is just clunky as people dive into rule books anyway. So that sort of first hour experience gets that out of the way, and then people can basically rock and roll with it, which is great.
It's great that you've disaggregated it so it's one-to-one learning the game, as opposed to, you know, the lecture theatre trying to teach the game when no one's really interacting with the game, or like, oh, we've got to do a whole planning cycle to teach the game. And, you know, I was on the J2 desk, so I didn't really see what you were doing on the CSS side, and, you know, and all the sort of issues that I think other PME institutions have hit trying to do this.
The sort of utopia of this would be that every syndicate gets the experience of the training, and then everybody then goes back into their roles and then execute the game. But you know, in terms of the time available, which is the biggest cost of the game, to be honest, is the time available to learn it is compressed against all the other competing aspects of everything else that one wants to achieve. And so, yeah, that would be the utopia. But in this case, just having 12 people to sit down and to teach it with them, you know, they're all motivated. Generally, they tend to be volunteers as well. And sorry, I should say, with those 12 people, they also have it's actually 24 because there is also their deputy standing on their shoulder as well. And then that engages a sort of there is a video to back it up if they want to use it, but getting hands on that sort of kinesthetic type learning is, you know, it's really good for memory and, you know, picking it up quickly, I think that's what the battle board enables. And you don't need big maps. You don't need lots of maps and a whole plan and everything else like that.
Which instantly puts people off. It feels a lot like work. So
Yeah.
there's been an article that you, and it's talking about wargaming more generally. So it's talking about the battle group wargaming system and Divisional Commander. This is available publicly on the British Army Review, which you can get from various places. How have the students reacted to it?
I have to say that in the sort of 2 and a bit years of my experience, I mean, I can't comment on battle group war game system. I've only done the play testing for it and not seen it in action. That's more Ant Mills, the co-author of the articles, remit. But in terms of what I have seen at the level that I have seen, at the level that we have been operating, over time, it has become much more accepted about as an execution methodology and a valid military core skill than it's just something that is the purview of a sort of a niche in the army or a niche within supporting organizations, etc., or experts that come in from different fields. I think that the fact that we are talking about openly, and in the previous issue of the British Army Review as well, it talked about wargaming. I can't remember who the author was, which is probably bad of me. Did read it, but I think the culture is changing, and that it's not that it's never been acceptable, but it's that people are now seeing the value because we're better at articulating about what it can do. And it's less about board gaming risks and, you know, risk the board game or whatever. And it's more about, it is a core professional military competence that everybody should be able to do at a basic level, at the least.
And yet the cover picture to the article is risk figurines, 2d6, and the map of Ukraine and Russia.
There's irony in all of it. Yeah.
That's great. Have you got any sound bites from any students who've said, like, you know, I'm thinking more rather than I enjoyed the war game or I enjoyed wargaming, as in I really understand the divisional level more than if you'd just given me the death by PowerPoint.
You've just given the soundbite. I've had that exact comment. 2 courses ago, an officer came up to me. I said, "Oh, what do you think about the war game?" Because, you know, lots of people have lots of really interested in opinions on it. Like the one that's from the last iteration that we've done. So the plan is now is we're going to do one more sort of change iteration, which will then go into the summer, and then the utopia of it will be is that the money's going to be put in place to have a Kriegsspiel box set for it that people can then use, and it's got all very nice tokens, nice rule sets, etc., etc., because presentationally that's important as well. And the reason why I say that is the one change that we're going to iterate on is the value of combat power in terms of rewarding people more in the deep, in terms of being able to create more attrition in the deep, to be able to shape the battle quicker in that 72 hours of how long the game of the game time. And actually, it does need adjustment. And that came from a student when I said, "What do you think of the game?" He said, "Absolutely teaches what we need to know, but I think we just need to reward the deep a bit more with in terms of the relative combat powers, in terms of what you can attrit, to be able to shape the enemy." And I was like, do you know what? That's pretty fair. I've had that 3 or 4 times now. I've had other students who have done operations, and it's like, well, did you wargame? I said, well, we wish we knew this before, wish we could do this or had the skill before we went into operations. There's fine, great, brilliant, and even if they just take the time to, maybe go, well, maybe we haven't got time to wargame, but what we'll do during our planning is, we'll just do a quick box method, bring up the sync matrix, about in time, box method, this little bit while we're doing COA dev planning. And then we take that back into our COA dev back brief and say, hey, we've just for reassurance, we have actually wargamed this, and these were the results of within this COA. If people are going away with that as a basic lesson, that you set your master question, what do you want to answer, and they can run a quick game with some sort of resolution mechanic, then brilliant. And everyone walks away from it going, yeah, that's good. And it does. And the good thing about Div Commander, even though I say it takes an hour to train people and it can take an hour or so to set up, if you're running a big game that industry has been paid to bring in, or you're doing a big event, it can take days to set them up. And obviously that comes with cost and infrastructure and all of those sorts of things. Whereas this, as you say, you can get a map out, you can get 2 battle boards out, you've got a rule book, you can learn it, you can execute a divisional game. Job done.
Awesome. Just a final question. What advice would you give to anyone in a PME institution looking to start out on their or improve their own wargaming programs?
Oh.
Briefly, if you could.
Network. I think you're not the first person.
Plagiarize.
Oh, no. You're not the first person to be doing it. I've had really positive interactions with US Marine Corps, with people there. I've had really positive interactions with people in industry who are either previous military or, they've come in and helped the military do things. And so you sort of like, well, what have you learned? What have you seen? So taking lots and lots of advice, I would say, is a start point, which I didn't have, but I built that network over time. And at the very start of that journey, looking to start and improve a sort of a war game program, is just set your question and answer your question, and guard against trying to create the game that's going to fit, suited to all purposes, because it doesn't exist, because they've all got holes and they'll do some good things. Well, I probably said something very bad there, haven't I? But it's and then rigidly defend it as well. That I think you called it scope creep there. Defend against scope creep. Go set your parameters, set your question. This is what the game's going to do. This is what it's going to answer. That's all it's going to do, because you're not going to get everything that's going to be catch-all. And that's, I suppose, the advice.
Mark, that's great. Thanks again for coming on, and thank you for sharing everything about Divisional Commander. Wish you all the luck scaling it up on the course and also pushing it out further.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, Ed.